On the 2nd of November, 1983, Congress passed Public Law 98-144 to amend Title V, United States Code, to make the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr. a legal public holiday and being recognized on the third Monday every January. It took 15 years to create the federal Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. Congressman John Coyers first introduced legislation for a commemorative holiday 4 days after King was assassinated in 1968. After the bill stalled, petitions endorsing the holiday containing 6 million names were submitted to Congress. Public pressure for the holiday mounted during the 1982 and 1983 civil rights marches in Washington. Congress passed the holiday legislation in 1983, and it was signed into law by President Ronald Reagan. More than 40 years after his death, Dr. King's example can continue to guide us in addressing our most critical issues. Each of us can contribute to strengthening our own communities by serving in Dr. King's honor, not only on the MLK holiday, but throughout the year. By making service part of our daily lives, together we can create and sustain opportunities for Americans to strengthen their own and others' economic opportunity, ensuring that more young people graduate from high school, support our military families and veterans, and help communities prepare for and recover from disaster. At this time, we would like to recognize the West Point Pre-K for making the booklets located on some of your tables. These booklets were written in honor of Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. At this time, I would like to introduce the West Point Gospel, Choir, Dance, and Glee Clubs who will be performing the song Glory from the movie Selma.
Glory comes, it will be yours, it will be yours. Oh, oh, one day, when the war is won, we will be sure, we will be sure. Oh, oh, glory.
To the heavens, no man, no weapon formed against, yes, glory is destined. Every day women and men become legends. Sins that go against our skin become blessings. The movement is a rhythm to us. Freedom is like religion to us. Justice is juxtaposition in us. Justice for all just ain't specific enough. One son died, his spirit is revisiting us. Truant living in us. Resistance is us. That's why Rosa sat on the bus. That's why we walked through Ferguson with our hands up. When it went down, we woman and man up. They say stay down, and we got up. Shots, we on the ground, the camera panned up. King pointed to the mountaintop, and we ran up. summer's now for every man, woman, and child. Even Jesus got his crown in front of a crowd. They marched with the torch, we gon' run with it now. Never look back, we done gone hundreds of miles. From dark roads, he rose to become a hero. Facing the League of Justice, his power was the people. Enemy is lethal, the king became regal. He saw the face of Jim Crow under a bald eagle. The biggest weapon is to stay peaceful. We sing, our music is the cuts that we bleed through. Somewhere in the dream we found an epiphany. Now we right the wrongs in history. No one can win a war individually. It takes the wisdom of the elders, the young people's energy. Welcome to the story we call victory. The coming of the Lord, my eyes have seen his glory.
Can we please give them another round of applause for their amazing performance? At this time, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Kurowski A. Salter. Dr. Salter is a United States Army Colonel retired and founder, president, and CEO of 4K Enterprises, and an academic research and development small business. He's a guest associate curator, project historian, and military subject matter expert at the Smithsonian Institution, National Museum of African American History and Culture, where he curates the inaugural exhibition titled Double Victory, the African American Military Experience, which opened fall 2016. As an Army Airborne Ranger, Dr. Salter commanded at every level through battalion and served as a senior staff officer at the Pentagon before retiring from the military. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Kurowski A. Salter.
I gave a presentation at the Smithsonian last week, and I followed an august individual, and I'm always asking, why do I always have to follow such great acts? So let's give a round of applause to the last group. And I'll do my best to fill those shoes. You guys may have noticed I came prepared for the weather. I have on my snowshoes. These are not my suit shoes, but I realized it was gonna be snowing out. I'm talking a little, to get myself, to get the nervousness out of me, because it's always humbling to be invited back to organizations and institutions, and institutions such as the United States Military Academy at West Point, where I had the opportunity to spend 3 years as a history professor. So to one of my cohorts, when I was a captain, Brigadier General Jeb, thank you for being here. Command Sergeant Major Gooten, thank you for being here. My invitee hosts, Lieutenant Colonel Doyle and Master Sergeant Oxidine, who invited me after Pat Locke, who some of you know, asked me last month if I would be willing to come up to the military academy and speak about my work at the Smithsonian. But oh yeah, we're already full for Black History Month. So come on ML King Day and try to weave some of Martin Luther King into the presentation. And interestingly enough, that will be very easy because Dr. Martin Luther King is also interpreted within the military gallery because, as some of you know, he did become more of a foreign affairs figure after 1965. I have to say 19 and 18 and 17 because as a historian, you'll say 1792, and a person says, well, that happened in 1992. So it was in 1965 where he began to come out against the Vietnam War. So obviously, we do talk about him in the military gallery, and you'll see some of that. So what my mission here is today is not to really talk about Dr. King per se, it's to talk about Dr. King and African Americans in the military, using the Military History Gallery at the Smithsonian, and also to talk about West Pointers. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, so I'm going to try to work this. So I made an attempt of making a mission statement. I retired 8 years ago. I haven't written a mission statement in 10 to 15 years, so this may not be the standard to today, but I said I'm coming to West Point, so let me put a mission statement. So this is my mission statement for today. What we're going to do, we're going to do three things. We're going to talk about African Americans in the military using the Military History Gallery at the museum. But we're also going to segue into how Dr. Martin Luther King is also interpreted within the military gallery. And then also I said, well, I'm coming to West Point, so let's focus on some of those West Pointers who are interpreted within the Military History Gallery. And our mission at the museum is to tell an American story, through the African American lens. That's the mission of the museum. So the mission of the Military Gallery, as you see there, is today I'm going to share an American military history stories through the African American military lens. Okay, so these are some bill slides. So what I want to do is show a cross-section of the museum. First of all, you can see that blue box up top. So as we are talking about the military gallery, understand that the military gallery is just a small part of the entire museum. The museum has 12 inaugural exhibitions. And so the military gallery is just one of those exhibitions. And that blue box that you see on that cross-section on the third floor, that's where the military gallery is located. And so what I want to do now is introduce you to the military gallery with a few bill slides and let you know how it's laid out before we get into the presentation. So that is the military gallery layout. The military gallery has 3 clusters, 10 sections, and 5 themes. So the first cluster, as you can see, so follow the red line and the red letters as I do the bill slides. We have a struggle for freedom section, which talks about African Americans from the American Revolution to the American Civil War. As you progress around, we get to a segregated military, and we tell the story of African Americans in the military, starting with the wars of American expansion in 1866 and going to World War II. You progress around, you get to the stirrings of change section where we talk about the Korean War, and we go to the current war on terror. And then we have some theme sections. This section in the gallery is where we interpret the story of all 89 African Americans who have been awarded 90 Medals of Honor. We have a theme wall where you see that red line, and we'll talk about that later on. We have 3 theme sections. There's one section that talks about women in the military. There's another section that talks about loss over time, those who gave the ultimate sacrifice to their country. And then we have a section called leadership, and we will revisit some of those in a second. And we also have a theater. We have a double victory theater. It seats 30 people. So where you see that red line, we have a screen. We have a 5-minute video. 30 folks can sit in there, and you can watch a loop film that talks about African Americans in the military. And we have a double V wall. This is where we weave in, again, our threads of continuity. I don't know if they still teach the threads of continuity in the military history department, social, economic, political, and cultural aspects and how those impact upon. Well, now, do they still do the threads of continuity? Okay, I guess not. All right. I know history has progressed 25 years since I taught here. And so I will say I say that to say this here. The Military History Gallery is not your ordinary military gallery. When you go into the museum, you are not going to see stories about men and women necessarily on the battlefield and cannons and guns. You see that, but you also see the social, cultural, economic, and political impact on why did individuals serve. And that takes me to this next point before I go on. You know, it's great to go into a museum and see great artifacts and images, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but a museum should exist to educate. So within the military gallery, in every section, we have an introduction panel, and that tells you what about the American Revolution, the American Civil War, World War II. But at the end of each one of those sections, I have what is called an impact and legacy section, which is the so what. Okay, so what? Over 200,000 African Americans served in the military during the American Civil War as United States colored troops or in the Navy, but what was the impact? So we talk about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and the Army Reorganization Act of 1866. So we have an impact and legacy. And so before I go on, Master Sergeant Oxidine, Roland, we had to figure this out. My embeds didn't quite plant the way I wanted to. We are in the military gallery. The military gallery is entitled Double Victory, the African American Military Experience, where we interpret the American military experience through the lens of African Americans. First thing that we have in the gallery is called the Wall of Service. And the Wall of Service is the entrance to the military gallery. And what the Wall of Service is, it has more than 75 battles and campaigns beginning prior to the American Revolution to the present that African Americans have participated in. When you get into the military gallery has thematic sections, but it also has a chronological sweep. And the chronology starts with the American Revolution and it goes to the War on Terror. And each section has a specific design. I have what we call bookends. At the beginning of every section, we have an intro panel which talks about that section and the service of African Americans. And at the end of each section, the American Revolution, we have an area called Impact and Legacy, which talks about the why. Okay, African Americans served, but what did that accomplish? How did it change anything? And so in between those two bookends, we have a host of artifacts and a host of images to allow us to tell the story. But I like to get to the American Civil War because this is where the gallery begins to become artifact rich. Hard to get artifacts prior to the American Civil War, especially with provenance to African Americans. But just like the larger society, which is segregated, the military is also segregated. So when you get to the gallery and you start with the wars of American expansion and you go to World War II, it's a segregated military. And we talk about those inequalities, yet the willingness to serve. We have been very fortunate to receive donations from individuals who have gone to their attics, their footlockers under their beds, and they say, hey, I have this artifact. Are you interested? And of course we're interested. On this side, we have three thematic areas. One talks about women in the military. Another talks about loss over time. And another talks about leadership. One of our sacred areas in the military gallery is the Medal of Honor. Technology testing 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. We'll give it a couple of sections. If not, we'll move on. Okay, so there's another minute and 20 seconds, and so what it concludes with, it talks about the Medal of Honor lens and a couple of other areas. And again, I think when you see, videography, it kind of brings it closer to home than just me talking up here. But then at the very end, I also tell the complexity of the military gallery. So we'll go ahead and move on. So when you come to the military gallery, you see that the red line to the right. That's where we're going from here. So we already talked about the Wall of Service. And so the Wall of Service and the intro panel, a museum is an art and a science. When you use the National Museum standards, you only get about 75 words to tell a visitor what that particular aspect of the gallery is about. Because when you go into a museum, you don't want to lose audience and have 300 words, and people don't come to a museum to read a book on the wall. So what we tell in the intro panel is what the gallery is about. But on this wall of service, we have the enlisted oath of office, because one of the things I kind of insisted upon is that we want the American public, when they come in and they visit the military gallery, to understand what you men and women and what I took as an oath of office, why we are held to a higher level or standard than most other institutions. And so it's very key. So when you walk into the Military History Gallery and we see people standing there reading the oath of office that we as men and women in our military take. Okay, so now let's move into Dr. King. So we talked about the stirrings of change. So what we're going to do now is we're going to visit this aspect of the Military History Gallery, Vietnam. And so let's talk about how Dr. King is interpreted within the Military History Gallery on this week where we honor his birthday. Well, some of us know that, Dr. King came out against the Vietnam War publicly in 1967. He struggled over that decision to come out publicly for about 2 years. And so in the military gallery, since we talk about the social, cultural, and economic and political threads, he is interpreted within the gallery. We have an image of Dr. King and we have this artifact. And those are the letters that you see, the wording that you see when you go into the museum, why he came out against the war. First of all, it was on April 16th, 1967, a famous image that we see in many history books. But the artifact is an album that had his speech, Why I Opposed the War. And you can see, basically, his main reason for opposing the war is because it was estimated, those figures that you see there, that only about $53 were being spent on what was the Poor People's Campaign that he and Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president, had begun to talk about as early as 1964, and it was progressing in 1965. The campaign actually became a Poor People's Campaign on the Mall in Washington in 1968. And so we interpret King and a host of other social aspects in the military gallery, how they relate to the military. He is also interpreted on the apex. So we're going to go visit this particular part of the gallery. And this is a quote that we use on the apex. The apex is a cool part of the exhibition, I think. It has 10 images, 5 on each side, and it has 9 quotes. And of course, as a historian, as a curator, you have from 200 or 300 images, 200 and 300 quotes to pick from, but it's your mission to pick those ones that you think will resonate and talk about your gallery. So you probably had a chance to read that quote. So Dr. King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in '64. He began to encroach into international affairs in '64, '65, and '66, because there were people telling him that you are now a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. You can no longer just have these campaigns that resonate within the continental United States, and that's what they were. Montgomery, Selma, and Birmingham, they were strategic campaigns. When I've given M.L. King speeches in the past, I've actually talked about them as campaigns because they were strategies. He was the general, he was the commander-in-chief, and he had staff officers, you can call them G1s through G3s. A lot of the security force in the civil rights movement were World War II veterans. So on the wall of service, he talks about, it seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor people, well, I was going to say Poor People's Campaign, of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the Poor People's Program. Then came the buildup of the Vietnam War, and I watched this program become broken and eviscerated. That was his main reason for standing against the Vietnam War, because he felt that money was going in a different direction when perhaps it should have been used in America. And so that is how King is interpreted within the military gallery. And of course, he has a history before and a short history after, because within a year after he came out publicly on national television, he was assassinated on 4 April 1968. And so we, as an American people, have this opportunity and this obligation to not only celebrate this time of year, what is called a day on, not a day off, which has been the theme for years, which means that we should continue to work for the forward progress of this nation. And that's one of the reasons why, when I was invited to come to West Point last month, and just coming here, and even my time here 25 years ago, the diversity of this institution and what it sends young men and women out to do to serve their country, to make this world a better place. And we are still the greatest nation on the earth because there are institutions like West Point, there are ROTC detachments like the ones I went to, and some of my peers in cohort who are in here, because we are the strongest military in the world, and I truly believe we will remain the strongest military in the world, and I believe that is because every single section of America is represented in our military. I see it in this audience, and it's men and women. So that's my piece on Dr. King in the military gallery. And so let's move on and talk a little bit about how West Pointers are interpreted within the gallery. I think I have some time, right, Master Sergeant? Oxenine, okay. So we're going to move to this section, so stirrings of the segregated military section, and we're going to go to the War of American Expansion. And so let's go to that section. So you saw this in the video. This is looking from the World War II section on down to the Wars of American Expansion, where you see that person standing. And that artifact that you see in the top left, that is John Hanks Alexander's uniform. John Hanks Alexander was the second African American to graduate from the United States Military Academy. And the text box to the top right, you can see it points to the image. So we have his image in the gallery. But instead of me talking to you, let's kind of, I'm going to back up. So let's roll it. We get a lot of media requests, so Stars and Stripes came and videotaped me 3 or 4 days.
Who was one of only 3 African-American graduates from West Point before 1900. The first was Henry Flipper, who graduated in 1877. The third was Charles Young, who graduated in 1889. But the second was John Hanks Alexander, who graduated in 1887. That's his image, and that is his uniform. And a museum is not a book on the wall, and the museum has an art and a science aspect of it. And some people come in here and they may ask, well, why don't you have a larger interpretation on Flipper in this section? He was the first. Well, a museum exists to tell stories through artifacts. We are still trying to get an artifact relative to Henry Flipper. We're very fortunate to have the uniform of John Hanks Alexander. So even when you see this uniform and you see John Hanks Alexander, we talk about Flipper and Charles Young. So you can use one artifact to tell a larger story. And that's what we always talk to people about when we get to have them one-on-one in the gallery.
Okay, thank you. It's always interesting when I watch those. When you're being videotaped, there's about 10 or 15 people standing around, so when I look at that, you wonder where I'm looking. There's usually someone over trying to adjust the lights. So we do get to talk about these stories on a national stage, and so it was just amazing for me as a person who had been studying history for more than 20 years to find out that John Hanks Alexander uniform still existed somewhere. And you can see the names of the people who donated those to you. So when people donate something to you, their name also gets put into posterity in the museum, and that was donated by the Francis Sampson Mask family. Okay, so let's move on. I think I have a few more minutes here. So we're going to visit this part of the gallery. We're going to visit the theme wall. And remember, I talked about the theme wall. The theme wall is where we talk about 3 separate themes. We talk about women in the military. That's not to say that they are not exhibited throughout the gallery, because they are. We also have this section called Loss Over Time. That's where we interpret those who made the ultimate sacrifice to this nation by giving their life during times of war. We also talk about those unseen injuries, especially in today's war where you have traumatic brain injuries, and also loss over time, or also those individuals who still come back but who may lose a limb. So loss over time talks about that aspect, and then leadership. So what we're going to do is we're going to visit leadership and loss over time in the gallery and talk about how West Pointers are, and John Hanks Alexander obviously was a West Pointer. So here are two other West Pointers that are exhibited. First of all, in the top left, we do interpret Charles Young and Henry O. Flipper. We just don't have any artifacts, but we do have this stereotype card, which was taken here at West Point, and that is what the card talks about. Henry O. Flipper, you can barely see it here, but he is in the back row on this image. And I think he may have been a firstie in this image, because I did see an image of Charles Young in the archives yesterday. I was here yesterday doing some research, and he was a firstie, and he also held that position in the formation. So although they graduated from West Point, they still experienced, as some of you know, being ostracized and discrimination during that period. You have to think about the period after the American Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crowism, and separate but equal. And we also, in loss over time, we have 6 interpretations, and one is of Second Lieutenant Emily Perez, who is a 2005 graduate of West Point. She deployed with her unit in December of 2005 and was killed in an IED on 12 September 2006. And I believe she's buried here at West Point. So she's one of those individuals. And one of the reasons I really wanted to use that interpretation in the gallery is because I had recently retired, and there was a debate when I was still on active duty, were women in combat? Well, those of us who wore the uniform, we always knew that they were debating this on Capitol Hill. So one of the things that this interpretation allows people to understand, that heck yes, women were in combat, and this interpretation allows that story to be told, which is now we know that Congress has subsequently said that, yes, women are in combat. And so this is the wall of the theme wall where you saw those two, but this is my last point where I get to say, roll it.
Johnson was the first African-American woman to be promoted to general officer, and she was promoted to general officer in 1979, and this is her uniform. Admiral Howard is the first African-American woman to be promoted to 4-star admiral, and she is actually the first woman, period, to be promoted to 4-star admiral in the Navy. She just happens to be African-American. This is her uniform. And so we have several other artifacts. Every single artifact in the Women in the Military section has direct provenance to an African American. And so we're very proud of that as well.
Okay, I'm going to end this with a question. General Jeb, are you in the class of 82? Okay, and so Michelle Howard, as you probably know, she is a United States Naval Academy graduate, and she was in the class of 82 at the Naval Academy, which is only the 3rd class to graduate women at our academy, because the first class that graduated women was in 1980. Okay, so my last slide, which is partly why I am here today. I understand that General Austin is coming next month, and I was told I also had some large shoes to fill, because he's also coming with an individual who spoke last month at the MLK, Ms. Fenwick, and of course President Swaggart is coming back where emeritus, and I was at Howard University when Patrick Swaggart was the president. But we also have these books called Double Exposure. This is volume 5. We have been fortunate enough, just like artifacts have been coming out of the woodwork that people had no idea existed, and we have those on exhibition at the museum, we are getting tons and tons of images that haven't been published. And so we published these books, and I have my show and tell. I forgot to bring it out of my bag, but we are putting those images in these small books. The first one is about children. The second one is about the Civil Rights Movement. There's one about women. There's one about portraits. And the 5th one happens to be about African Americans in the military, where I got to work on that quite heavily. And one of your alumni is on page 54 and 55. So General Austin is in this book, and these are the two images that we have relative to him on page 54 and 55. Okay, that concludes my presentation. It's been my honor and my pleasure to share the museum with you, and also to talk a little bit about how Dr. King is interpreted within that gallery and some of your cohorts who came before you. Thank you. Okay, all right. Oh, no, that's not my phone. I was wondering.
That's okay. Can we please give Dr. Salter another round of applause? Sir. Sir, if you can come back up. Thank you. At this time, Cadet Kara Keene, the Brigade Respect Captain, will present our guest speaker with a small token of appreciation for the United States Military Academy.
Sir, thank you so much for your words today. It was a privilege.
Okay, thank you.
Here's a small token of our appreciation.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you. All right, thank you. All right.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, thank you again for attending today's event, and a special thank you to Dr. Salter for helping us honor the memory of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. We hope to see you at our next observance luncheon, Black History Month, on the 13th of February. This concludes today's observance.